I'm John McCarthy, the Medical Director for LVHN, Medevac Lehigh Valley Health Network in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So this is one of the number of lectures that we're going to put together. Flight physiology will be the topic today. Now, again, we have 4 helicopters, most of which fly around 3,500 feet. Yeah, we're going to cover flight physiology because even at that altitude, a number of times may affect the patient during the transport. But obviously, it's also good to know for a number of other issues, depending on where you end up working, whether it is a fixed aircraft or at a higher altitude like Colorado. So, great topic, which I love. I'm a pilot also, but been doing Medevac for many years. So, let's get through one case. First is, what law did the orthopedic surgeon break? So this is an actual event a number of years ago. So there was a 35-year-old female had a history of spontaneous pneumothorax. She was flying along. They were at 35,000 feet. And when she began with chest pain and trouble breathing, the orthopedic surgeon apparently had a stethoscope on board, noticed decreased breath sounds on the left. So he made a pseudo chest tube. Don't ask me the details because we probably don't want to know. He was asked by the pilot, should we land and get her to an ambulance? He said, absolutely not. She's got a pneumothorax. We have to take care of it before we go down. So he did decompress the chest, landed safely, transported by ground, went into the local emergency department and had a chest tube inserted. We'll talk more about that. So, quick overview. We're going to talk about the atmosphere itself, some of the gas laws, which are very predictable and apply to some degree of what we do, some of the stresses of the flight, especially as any flight crew or any job that we do. It's really magnified while you're flying in an aircraft. Pressurization, decompensation, and may or may not do some test review questions. So real quick, basics, which most everybody knows, but in the atmosphere, we all know 21% for oxygen. We all know that, at least before we get into some of the education, nitrogen by far is the most predominant molecule in the air. So atmospheric pressure, when we mention that, it actually is really the weight of all the molecules. Think of a tube. If you have, let's say, marbles filling that tube, the ones on the bottom are going to have the most weight on them as opposed to the last few that you put in on the top. So that's really what atmospheric pressure is. It's actually weight of the molecules. So the physiologic zone depends on where you go, the height that you go. It then changes the environment that we live in. So sea level to 10,000 feet is what most of the unpressurized aircraft can fly in. So there you can see how quickly it drops from 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level, even going up to only 10,000 feet. It almost goes in half to 483. So you can develop some symptoms at that time, but it really doesn't hit you all of a sudden. So if there is any problems, you get some oxygen, or more importantly, just descend where there's more oxygen spread out. So the physiologic deficit zone, here's when you really start to have less oxygen because it's more spread out. So 10,000 to 50,000 feet, essentially when you talk about commercial aviation, it's about 35,000 feet and all variations of that. But you can see how much the barometric pressure drops from 43 to 87 millimeters of mercury. So if you don't have the weight on the molecules, they spread out more. So you don't have as much concentration of oxygen in particular. So how is that dealt with? It's actually the pressurized cabins. And most pressurized cabins are about equivalent, about 8,000 feet. And also supplemental O2 to have that available. So once you get above that, now we're in the partial space. It's changes in the gravity. But there you need the pressurized suit. We'll talk more detail about that. So our space equivalent zone is only 120 miles up. So we have this huge planet, and you look up in the sky, you see the blue. But if you see any atmospheric, any of the aircraft, any of the shuttles and so forth, they take a picture, and it is only this thin blue line, which is only 120 miles before you get out into space. Just to put that into equivalent, with the, at least for us with Medevac, we fly, around 3,000 to 3,500 feet. That's only half a mile up, 0.66. At 10,000 feet, it's only 1.89, and 35,000, 6 miles. And yet, the atmosphere goes out to 120,000 miles. So, it's interesting, we don't realize exactly how many miles are up, but that defines that a little bit better. But obviously, once you're out in space, there's no other weight that's involved because of the lack of pressure. So there's some gas laws, again, going back into physics from way back when, but it really comes down to very predictable, very good ability to calculate these things with pressure, temperature, volume, and then the mass of the gas. So real quick, Boyle's law is volume and pressure. Temperature is the same. So that applies from the flight physiology standpoint. If you have a pneumothorax, you have same temperature, so that doesn't change. But the volume, you have less pressure, less weight on the molecules, so they start spreading apart. Because of that, that increases your volume. So one good example is pneumothorax. You have a certain amount of escaped air into the chest, now with less pressure, that's going to expand. And that's why it can make a pneumothorax then become a tension pneumothorax. Charles' law, it's related to the pressure and temperature. So the volume doesn't change. One example is the O2 cylinder. You don't change the volume, but you increase the pressure from one bottle to the other. And that's how the oxygen cylinder can actually get more warm to the touch because of that change in the pressure. Dalton's law, pressure and the mass of the molecules. As you decrease to certain altitudes, you increase the pressure. So again, when you get higher up, less pressure, those molecules spread out. There's less of a concentration of oxygen in particular, and can result in hypoxia. So, and put it into perspective, at 18,000 feet, you have less than half of the oxygen that's available because it's spread out more compared to sea level. Henry's law, it's the pressure in the gas above a solution. So one great example is a soda bottle. It's sitting there nice and comfortable. You open up the cap, or let's use the example of shaking a soda. You open it up. With the energy, you've now released some of the gas in the liquid up to the gas above it, in the airspace above the liquid, and that comes flying out because now you've increased the pressure out of the liquid up into the gas above it. And that's really what comes down to decompression sickness. You've changed that pressure quickly, being deep at sea, very increased pressure, you come up too quickly, all the gas in the blood comes flying out into the liquid, or into the air, which is the alveoli, and pulls the oxygen essentially out of the blood itself. And then that can also make it even worse. It takes that away, but also some pressure changes with volume changes. So the whole point with the shaking a soda bottle or the decompression sickness is slow that process down, then it will equal out between the liquid and the gas. So stresses of flight, lots of different components. So decreasing the partial pressure of oxygen, which we talked about. Barometric pressure, thermal changes, big change there, humidity, all these things kind of come down. Fatigue, big one as far as when you're working your shifts, working too long, not enough rest. So not enough oxygen, hypoxia. You can't keep the oxygen in the blood because of the changes in pressure that we just talked about. Hypercapnia, you can't get, or you get an increased amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. And again, that change is different than the oxygen. It flows different than the oxygen itself. So at altitude, as we mentioned, the O2 available at the alveoli is different. Because there's a lack of that, then you try and get more out of the blood. It doesn't exchange well. So O2, cabin pressure, getting down to a lower altitude are things that help all with that. So it's usually the biggest components when you start seeing changes in the crew or the patient. So the whole tentative treatment is actually descent. It's really an intellectual impairment, so that's part of the problem with this slow change. Often it's not noticed and then can become a big issue. So to put this in perspective as far as hypoxia, just the saturations, 0 to 10,000 feet, 90 to 98%, that's okay. A lot of patients are in an emergency department are like that, and obviously the physiologic changes with that. Once you get up to 10 to 15,000 feet, drop down in the 80s. And again, may be very gradual as far as the ascent if you lose pressure of the aircraft. And then above 15 to 20,000 feet, so that's about 70 to 80 on the pulse ox. And again, that can abruptly change it. There's been a number of cases where the planes are still flying because they're all automated, and yet the crew has already died. They haven't noticed anything. And then they become hypoxic, lose consciousness, and they never even noticed anything was going on at the time. Above the critical stage, 20,000 to 30,000 feet, and you go down very quickly. So to put this in perspective time-wise, you have to obviously address it quickly, and in some of these even very quick. If there's a loss of pressure, and sometimes that's very obvious in some of the commercial flights, you can see the difference. 20,000 feet, you have a half hour to try and fix things, whereas at 50,000 feet, you'll have seconds to change that. Hypoxia, obviously, administering O2, but also recognizing the symptoms, again, can be very gradual, and then can decompress as far as the intellectual component and the judgment component, which often spirals down to not picking that up and getting worse. Kind of interesting also, positive pressure breathing. Above 40,000 feet, again, the gas is expanding, so it's okay to do a active expiration, but it's passive as far as the inspiration. So the pressure's going in, but it's harder to push it back out. All right, the stressors of flight obviously just increase pressure. May not notice it at the time, but certainly does affect a lot of the physiologic components. One example there is with equipment. Rather than have a ET tube or any type of balloon in cuffs, you want to use actually liquid because it won't expand like the air, like in an ET tube on the cuff for that. You can see the changes in the barometric pressure. At sea level, it doesn't change. Your little cuff on an ET tube row doesn't change. But you go up to 25,000 feet, it's 3 times larger. And at 43,000 feet, 9 times larger. Let me use one example. I was flying with my chairman of emergency medicine in his plane. Altitude, we were probably only about 6,000 feet. While we're climbing up, we hear this huge boom. Going through all the equipment, everything seems fine. We look in the back and end up being a bag of potato chips that actually blew because of this increased pressure and expansion. So things like, and this is probably more very important when you're flying on an aircraft, things you don't want to do. You don't want to be chewing gum because you're swallowing more air. Certainly carbonated beverages, another issue as far as getting more gas on board. So walking around, try to equalize that pressure, loosening restrictive clothing because of that increased expanding gas, which is also otherwise unpleasant. So any gas-containing components in our body are major issues. So even that middle ear, the classic severe pain when you're descending, and that's really because of that pressure now. When you go down, is somewhat changing. It's actually pushing the eardrum, the TM, even closer because you're now increasing the pressure as you're descending, and extremely painful at that time. So whatever you can do to help normalize that pressure is really the big component. So it comes down to don't fly with a URI, something simple like that. The eustachian tube gets closed down. You can't equalize that pressure in the ear, and then it becomes very, very painful. Same thing with the sinuses. You're changing that air within the sinuses, increasing the pressure or decreasing the pressure, whether descending or ascending. So again, you don't have a URI, it can be extremely painful. So try not to fly with that. All right, so from the pressure with the respiratory, pneumothorax is a huge one. Even if you're only doing 3,500 feet, if someone has a known pneumothorax, that can, even with that small amount, depending on how much change they can afford, can really make a difference between a pneumothorax and a tension pneumothorax. So this goes back to our first case example. So the patient's at 35,000 feet, has a pneumothorax, and yet the orthopedic surgeon said, do not descend, because it was a great concept. He was worried about expanding. In reality, again, the gas expands the higher you go up. So if they had descended, the amount of volume would have, the pressure would have gone down, the volume of the pneumothorax would have gone down, and probably would not need a chest tube in that situation. So it really was the opposite, which would have been a good thing to do. Another good example, COPD. Their blebs can start rupturing as it increases the pressure at a higher altitude. Not going into all the details of this, but with that pressure, changes in volume, as far as ventilators, I actually even went through one of these with a 5-day-old transport one time. If it's a pneumatic controlled device, as a ventilator, all those things as far as volume, pressure, change, so it's really hard to use them at that point. So the better situation is just electronic controlled. But even that, the tidal volume may change with the changes of altitude, yet all the functions of the pneumatic controlled ventilators can be a major issue for the higher transports. As far as thermal, so temperature really changes dramatically every 1,000 feet you go up. It's 2 degrees centigrade. So again, that gets very cold very quickly. But that's another component as far as stress, dehydration, getting more confused also. Humidity, again, below 16,000 feet, that's where the humidity is. Above that, there's very little water vapor. So that can get you very dry very quick there also. Noise, and we kind of know this already as far as on the ground, major issue as far as being with any aircraft, especially the helicopter also. And again, we already know this. At what level do you need to have protection? So it's certainly at 115, you need to have some type of protection for the hearing. But you can even see within the cabin of a helicopter, it's pretty high also. And again, there's so many different ways of protecting, but at least up to earplugs. There's only so much you can go up to, 115, whereas the other devices should be much higher as far as decreasing the amount of decibels coming in. And also some noise cancellation devices is another good component. So again, all this is another effect as far as stress, fatiguing you, getting changes in as far as your thought process, just because it's another distracting, fatiguing component. Vibration, same type of thing. You may not even notice it per se, but that actually does get transmitted, and especially in a helicopter now with the rotor blades, along with everything else, really does make a difference. Another thing to add on your stress. Major fatigue or just exhaustion. One, the flight will do that, but also the jobs we do. If we're busy, didn't get enough sleep, really does add up. And it's one thing of making bad decisions and errors, and that can really have a major impact from the aeromedical standpoint in particular. So a number of other causes, again, kind of all adds in. And this is where you have to be really careful, and it doesn't matter necessarily what altitude you are, per se. It's when this is all added up, but certainly even more pronounced at higher altitudes. Circadian rhythm, again, it gets down to the physiologic variations as far as your body temp, heart rate, and so forth. Jet lag, if you're transporting, again, this is all from our standpoint, commercial flights. For every hour shift in time, for me to fly over to Ireland is 5 hours difference. It's supposed to be 24 hours per hour of flights, 5 days before you actually accommodate, at least physiologically. Alcohol, this is the other reason we don't drink alcohol when we're working our shifts. At 10,000 feet, that's 3 times the amount of drinks compared to its sea level. And again, it's all the other components that hide into it, especially dehydration and some hypoxia. A lot less expensive, 1 drink. You get 3 drinks for the cost of 1, but bad combination. Carbon monoxide, which we already talked about, but it jumps up dramatically also with the altitude. Kind of mentioned also decreased night vision accuracy with the hypoxia and the increased carbon monoxide. fatigue, fatigue, fatigue. That's probably the more common ones that we will see at our altitudes, but it really does give you the ability to make some bad decisions, which have a huge impact. Physical fitness, while we're talking about all these things, being in good shape is a huge component as far as be able to adapt for the altitude changes physiologically, but also increases your ability to stay very sharp because of the decreased stress of the flight, as well as the use of O2. Spatial disorientation, and that can happen regardless of the altitude, but it happens at a number of different components. As you see, yaw, pitch and roll, but also whether you're climbing or descending. Pressure sensation is different, and for a patient, they're usually head towards the nose of the aircraft, and that makes it even worse for patients sometimes. But this is a classic for the pilots. Big concern, having the second person there, a second pilot or a crew member up front, so that they may not be having any spatial disorientation. So at least to have one of the people to at least point it out, or adjust with it, or take over for the other person that is having spatial disorientation. IFR, relying on the instruments, is another component. Prevention, again, always having a horizon is a huge component, but once you're flying IFR, you don't necessarily have that. You have to rely on your instruments. You got to relax. Again, horrible that you think the aircraft is completely out of control, but you just have to believe what you're feeling is not necessarily what is happening. So the other comfort factors, again, stress along the lines, but this is really an inner ear vertigo per se, and that happens from a number of different reasons that our brain is telling us something's happening when it's actually not. So prevention. Figure the stresses that's going to be going on, certainly fatigue itself, not getting enough sleep, working too hard, other potential for hypoxia. URI symptoms, again, certainly for our job, but also commercial flight. Anticipate what's going to change with the changes in pressure, and having good physical condition is a huge component as far as the stresses themselves. From a decompression sickness, and again, you may get divers along those lines. If there's a problem where you have decompression, treat yourself first, O2 right away, and then you can help others. Trying to be a hero and trying to help someone else is going to take you down, and then you can't help them. So rapid descent, if there was an issue as far as a decompressed aircraft, often they'll go down very quickly to get to that point, below 10,000 feet, where those physiologic things change to allow you to be functional and not have the adverse effects of the higher altitude. Hyperbaric therapy, as we talked about even from divers, they go down. It's much like the shaken soda bottle. Once they have the increased pressure down there, they come up. It's that the soda bottle that's shaken, it gets time, it will equalize back between the gas above the liquid and the gas in the liquid, and that's what the hyperbaric therapy is actually. Unpressurized aircraft, it's everything that we talked about, but now affecting physiologically, but also mechanically, everything else that we operate in. That's the equipment that we use, and that's the environment that we go into. Respiratory variations, just the physiology from that. Our FiO2 has changed. Our tidal volumes have changed. Respiratory rate to accommodate for that has changed. So we get great control, even in some patients, minimal altitude change can have an effect on all of them. So in summary, you need to understand the stresses of flight. Most important, we need to be good providers and take care of our patients and take care of each other on the crew, because it can be a huge challenge just to fly with all of those components of stress. So anticipate what might be the issue.